Good afternoon, everyone. Just a few instructions. Kindly join with audio option. And then like yesterday, we will have a short presentation of session by our resource person for 40 minutes. Then we will open the floor for discussion for another 40 minutes. Yesterday, there were many questions. So that way, we'll keep the floor open today for discussion. If you have any questions in between, kindly type it in the chat box and send it to me. We will take up all Q&A session at the end of the discussion.
Ramya ma'am,
Yes. Yes, Father.
Participants, they have been connected to the audio.
Yes,
they
Father.
won't receive any communication from our side. So whatever we talk, they won't get it.
Yes,
so
sir.
one option we have it. We can type this matter in the chat box.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So they have the option to see that.
Yes, Father. Same thing I'm doing, sir. Same way only, Father. Yeah. Hearty welcome to the second day of webinar on Indian strategic relations in post-COVID world order. So let us begin our second day session with a silent prayer. Thank you. Respected Reverend Dr. Agustin George, our Vice Principal, Christu Jayanti College. Resource person for the day, Mr. Anshuman Chowdhury, a senior researcher who is in the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, New Delhi. Honorable Dr. Gopakumar Evi, Dean, Faculty of Humanities. Professor S.J. Michael, HOD of Department of Social Sciences and Languages, and colleagues from my department and participants from all the institutions from all over India, my students and everyone. Hearty welcome to each and every one of you. Allow me to begin today's session too with a short introduction about Christu Jayanti College. As I said, our college began its academic journey in 1999 with 9 students. We are now 7,000 plus students in our 21st academic year. This institution is managed by members of St. Joseph Province of Carmelites of Mary Immaculate, an indigenous religious congregation that was founded by Saint Kuriakose Elias Chavura. We are an autonomous institution. We are affiliated to Bengaluru North University, and we are re-accredited with the A grade in 2015. That was the highest grade at the time. We are going for third cycle of accreditation. And we are rated by several survey agencies as one of the best institutions in India. We have also been rated as the best emerging college by India Today survey. And we are also delighted to find a place in the National Institution Ranking Framework, NIRF, in 2019 and 20. We are very proud of the fact that we are one of the private unaided institutions who have found a place to be ranked as one of the best colleges of India. And our School of Management program has an international accreditation. They have been accredited by ACBSP, that is Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs. So the institution focuses on academic enrichment of children and holistic development of all its students. So even during this pandemic time, in this period of uncertainties too, the institution has organized several academic programs for the enrichment of the children. Around 65 programs have been done, connected with 25,000 participants, spreading knowledge and standing by our motto of spreading light and prosperity. So the main reason we are able to do so, I want to acknowledge, it is because of the quick adaptability and availability of latest technology and training that was given to Jayantian fraternity by under the dynamic leadership and guidance of Reverend Father Agustin George. He is a great inspirational leader, a motivator, an enabler of change, and who always sees an opportunity even under dire circumstances. So it is a great privilege for the Department of History for inviting Father Augustine George to this program and give a short presidential address. So on behalf of Department of History, hearty welcome to you, Father, for this webinar. And I request, yes, Father.
Ramya ma'am, okay.
Yes, sir.
Am I audible to you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, can I proceed?
Yes, sir.
So thanks for the wonderful welcome note and introduction about the college. We are very happy that the history department is organizing a program that is very, very relevant. Today we have a right resource person, Mr. Ankush Main Chowdhury, with much knowledge in this area. Moreover, he can enlighten all of us with his insights, with his research findings, how our country has to take a lead after the post-COVID-19 pandemic. So I joined with the entire Christu Jayanthi family and especially the Department of History. We have, as Madam said, we have Dean, Mr. Professor Gopakumar sir, the coordinator, Professor Michael sir, and the history department head, Ramya ma'am, the faculty members, and other participants are here. On behalf of all of you, I take this time to thank Mr. Ankush Main Chowdhury for his readiness to share his views with all of us. Sir, we commend your service to the society. We commend your availability and willingness to take the session. So it is going to be one of the best sessions that we are going to have. I was reading an article yesterday. There are many articles are coming. I took a break from the webinar since this article, took me to the another level, because this article is good enough to arise curiosity in me. It is about reverse innovation. I was so curious with the topic itself, the reverse innovation. Mostly I'm in the technical field. What is going to be the reverse innovation? This article actually is dealing with how the countries are managing the present situation. And they have made an analysis of the developed countries, developing countries, and yet to be developing countries. Wherein that we can find that the developing countries and yet to be developed countries, they could manage this pandemic situation obviously in a well manner compared to the developed countries. It is because of the kind of resilience they have. It is because of the kind of the system they have in place, facing the many challenges they faced in the recent back. So the article is speaking about, I think we need to go back, we need to understand the priority, and we need to equip ourselves depending upon the need, the priority, and the safety of the people. The things actually, looking at the future, there are a lot of anxieties. Sometimes we are getting some intimidating feeling. But that if you look at the other aspect, this is very much promising as well. It is taking to the new order. Former National Security Advisor of NSA of India, Mr. M.K. Narayanan, remarked recently, there is a great shift taking place. We are moving from the global order that we have known since 1945 to a new global order, an extremely uncertain one. And in some ways, the geopolitical situation is far more threatening than the geoeconomics. So in the post-Cold War order, nations may look more inwards, focus on the national interest, compromising on the goals of the international organizations such as UN or WHO. India has the resilience to survive the crisis. In his address to the nation, our Honorable Prime Minister identified 5 key pillars for our future economic roadmap, including economy, infrastructure, demography, democracy, and the supply chains. The academic fraternity can and must definitely contribute to the recovery roadmap of India. The pandemic has highlighted the global shortage of the trained personnel in various sectors, especially in the healthcare and in the digital domain. Any graduates of today needs skills of the 21st century with the ability to adapt and learn. And this is the need of the time, and this is going to be the order that we all are facing. I really appreciate the efforts of the Department of History in organizing the webinar Indian Strategic Relations in Post-COVID World Order, providing a learning platform for the fruitful academic interaction. We could see that there are a lot of participants from across the country and participants from outside our nation. Very happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the Presidency family. I appreciate your passion to learn more, to proact to the situation. And I really understand all of you that how you are taking all the effort to enrich yourself to become more professional people. So that means that you can do a lot if you are a teacher to your students, and if you are a practicing people to the society, and I think as a whole to the nation as it is. So appreciating all the participants, and once again, I place and record my appreciation to the Department of History. That is a very small department here. But what I could see and I could feel that the kind of programs they organize, there are many programs out there, but some programs stands out because of the information, the informative things, and the value that it generates. So the programs organized by the history department stands apart. So congratulations to the head of the department, ma'am, and the teachers in the department. Congratulations to Michael sir, the coordinator of the social science in the department, and the Gobu sir for the effective leadership. So once again, I place on record our gratitude to Mr. Ankushman Chowdhury for taking the session, for coming to the this virtual platform to share his experience, his expertise, his findings, and his insight. Wishing all of you all the best. I remain. Thank you very much. Over to you, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Father. You have indeed given us a very right introduction, and it has set the tone for today's session. Around 167 faculty members have joined now. Yesterday we had 261 participants, so I am hoping more people to come in. So hearty welcome to each and every one of you on behalf of Department of History. And I'm sure there were a lot of questions in your mind yesterday. There were a lot of questions which asked about how Indian foreign policy priorities are changing, both in substance and style yesterday. They were asking questions relating to how India's future role may change. Will India play a very dominant role in South Asia? Or will India get a permanent seat in United Nations Security Council? Whether India will play a greater role in G20 and Indo-Pacific? Whether we need to feel threatened about the rise of China or US ambivalence. So to answer this and for many other questions, we have invited our resource person for the day, Mr. Ankushman Chowdhury, a senior researcher, as well as who has great expertise in his daily activities of knowing about the peace and conflict stories all over the world. So I request my colleague, Professor Himango, to introduce our resource person and lead him to today's session. So over to Hemango sir.
Madam, you had to unmute you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I have done that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Nelson Mandela. Good afternoon, everyone present here who have joined us from across the country and also outside. It is indeed a very special pleasure to welcome the speaker for today's webinar, Mr. Anshuman Chaudhary. Mr. Chaudhary is a Delhi-based policy analyst, currently working as a senior researcher and coordinator of the Southeast Asia Research Program at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. He was also the first GIPSA visiting fellow to the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin last year. He primarily works on the themes of foreign policy, armed conflict, citizenship, and refugees. Anshuman has written over 100 articles on these issues for various national and international publications, including The Hindu, The Diplomat, Asia Times, South Asia Journal, First Post, The Wire, and Scroll, and has also appeared on a number of TV debates. He is also the founding editor of 11th Column, an online magazine on politics, geopolitics, conflict, and society. Anshuman holds an MSc in Conflict Prevention and Peace Building from the School of Government and International Affairs, Durham University, and a BA Honours in History from Ramjas College, University of Delhi. His MA dissertation was on the United Liberation Front of Assam, focusing on the organization's historical trajectory. Anshuman is also an independent photojournalist and filmmaker. On a personal note, it is such a pleasure and a matter of pride to welcome one of my very own classmates for today's webinar as a resource person to shed light on shifting equations and changing priorities. On behalf of the management of Presidency College and the Department of History, I welcome you, Anshuman, to amidst us, and I request you to kindly take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hemango, and thanks a lot, Father George and Ramya ma'am. I'm very delighted to be here today. I was actually very happy when Hemango invited me for this because, as he mentioned, we did our undergraduate together in the same class in Ramjas College. So it was very good to connect, and I'm very happy to be here today and sharing my insights on this very timely and crucial sort of topic. I am not sure how many of you were there yesterday. I was attending the session yesterday. And Dr. Subhachandran actually gave a very, very lucid and succinct sort of rundown of what this world is going through at the moment and the shifting nature of the world order, so to say. I will try my best not to repeat what he said because, of course, when we discuss changing strategies and changing priorities of India, there's a lot to do with how the world system is evolving. I think one thing that becomes clear even from the discussion yesterday is that there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. There's a big lack of clarity on what's going to happen. And I think that's a characteristic trait of a process of change. Any process of change brings along with it a great deal of uncertainty. But at the same time, when we discuss what the world is going to look like after COVID-19, or what India's sort of priorities should be after COVID-19, we should remember one thing, that the global order had already begun to shift before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. And that's an important bit to know, because the change had already initiated, was initiated, and COVID-19 has only accelerated that change in a way. The priorities of the different sort of blocks, if I may say so, of the world was already undergoing a lot of flux. There was a lot of talk about global power shifting from the global north to the global south, particularly China. The refugee crisis of the 2010s, the coming to power of so-called right-wing populists around the world. these kind of Brexit, these kind of developments had already sort of disturbed the status quo, the post-Cold War status quo that the world was going through after the 90s. I think everything that we speak today should be within that context, that the flux had already started. So what I'm going to do today is basically sort of divide my remarks into 3 specific sections. I'm going to actually follow a more specific trajectory. I've talked about certain specific events because Dr. Subhachandran, I feel, gave a very good, nice overview of the matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what has happened so far in context of the Indian strategy or the Indian foreign policy. Second, I'm going to talk about what could happen in the post-COVID scenario. I must say that I don't want to spend much time on this section in terms of what could happen because it's speculation. And I don't think we should dwell so much on speculation. The third thing that I'm sort of going to talk about is what should India do in this particular scenario. In that sense, I think it makes sense to sort of jot down or go through the kind of events or the kind of steps that India has taken in the recent past, particularly in context of the COVID-19 pandemic. In that sense, I think how sort of I will lay it down is in terms of what has happened is I will talk about certain specific instances of India's foreign policy priorities and choices, right? So what has New Delhi done since the COVID-19 pandemic hit us? One of the great things that Delhi has done is sort of engaged in a whole set of multilateral experiments, beginning with South Asian multilateralism. India has initiated a video conference with the SAARC nations, has tried to formulate a regional response to the pandemic, a joint regional response to the pandemic. Now, this is interesting and important because SAARC as a South Asian body was lying dormant for a long time. If not for a long time, then at least for the last 3-4 years, for a bunch of issues, primarily the India-Pakistan tiff, the perennial India-Pakistan tiff. Instead, sort of the focus had shifted to BIMSTEC, and South Asian countries were looking to BIMSTEC to advance their interests. Hence, the fact that the Indian government initiated some kind of action with SAARC, and which included Pakistan remarkably, is important because it shows some kind of, as Father George mentioned, it shows some kind of resilience in the regional order. And this is a bigger point that I wish to make. That a lot of times, what I have been seeing in the recent past is a lot of talk about how the world is going to dramatically change after the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't particularly think that's going to happen. Certainly, there are going to be shifts and changes in certain pockets, but we often tend to sort of exaggerate or be hyperbolic about changes that events such as pandemic bring about. Because the world order ultimately is far more resilient than we think it to be. It has its own ways to fall back in place after a disruption, right? So in that sense, I think we need to keep that in mind. Coming back to SAARC, it's important to see what kind of steps the Indian government has taken with SAARC. It's noteworthy that within SAARC alone, as of June 3, India supplied aid worth rupees 15.7 crores, which is in the form of medical aid, information exchange program, and food supplies to particularly Maldives. Now, what is interesting is that India has also extended its own integrated disease surveillance portal, or ISDP, to SAARC nations, so that their surveillance capacities of sort of keeping a watch over a pandemic or a future pandemic gets improved, right? India has also initiated video calls with G20 members. In fact, this was the first virtual G20 meeting, and India was the one who sort of initiated the process and pitched the idea of a virtual G20 meeting. India has also conducted a video call with BRICS members on 28th of April, Importantly, India has also initiated a video call with certain Indo-Pacific powers within the Indo-Pacific coordination group, which includes Australia, countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam, right? So these are sort of why I am sort of focusing on specific events and instances is because it gives us a broader reflection of where India's priorities lie, right? The one important thing that sort of India has done and actually used the pandemic to its advantage is ramp up its medical diplomacy, right? India was always a major pharmaceutical supplier, particularly to the United States. India almost has a near monopoly on the manufacturing of HCQ tablets. So we have seen New Delhi sort of use that advantage or the groundwork that they already have to its own benefit during the pandemic. It has offered pandemic-related assistance to over 120 countries in various forms, which include supply of HCQ tablets, PPEs, and other stuff. It has even reached out to countries, unlikely countries like Antigua and Barbuda, Dominican Republic. I think what it does is it actually helps boost India's credibility, or it helps boost, it helps sell India as a partner which can not just promise stuff but also implement, right? So I think that's very crucial. But at the same time, we should also remember that it's not just India who is doing this alone. China too has supplied medical equipments to a large number of countries, and that is something that India should be aware of. Regardless of the quality of the equipment that China is supplying, it is doing so, right? India has also taken certain restrictive steps to protect its own economy and sort of protect its own financial assets. Out of these, I think the biggest step that India has taken is it has imposed mandatory restrictions on Chinese FDI in India, that all foreign investments from China now have to be routed through the government necessarily. I think that was done to protect Indian companies from predatory buying by Chinese companies, which had started right after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this also reflects a larger point here, that countries, something that I'm going to also refer to later, that countries probably are going to become a little more protectionist or a little more protective about their national economies, resources, and assets as we move into the post-pandemic stage. Now that is natural because national economies across the world have suffered immensely. So it's only natural for countries to sort of look to shield its domestic constituencies from excessive foreign outflow or external outflows. Now, importantly, India has also sort of joined international efforts primarily led by Australia at the World Health Assembly, which was held last month, and to probe basically China's role in if not spreading, then failing to check the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now this is crucial because even before the pandemic hit, India had initiated and become part of a so-called anti-China or a counter-China, so to say, alliance in the Indo-Pacific in the form of the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. And we have also seen Australia raise its voice against China even far more than it was doing earlier. So I think this particular move of India choosing to openly side with Australia doesn't come as a surprise, right? India at the same time has also signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Australia, which is a very crucial Indo-Pacific partner for India. And this was actually in the offing for a long time. Various developments had stopped, had not allowed either country to sign it, but finally they have signed a CSP with Australia. At the same time, we should remember that there were certain discussions about Taiwan being included in the World Health Organization, and India did not seem very keen to support that. Ultimately, there was a lot of debate about whether India should do that or not. Finally, India actually didn't do it. That is also understandable given the sensitive nature of the Taiwan issue. It tends to irk China, and for India, the costs of doing that could be high, particularly given what's going on at the moment, right? these were sort of the good parts that have happened so far, right? But it's all not, the story is not all rosy. There's a fair bit of downswing that India has seen. India's international image and foreign policy has seen in the past few months. To start with, I think the biggest downswing that India's foreign policy has seen is that its neighborhood relationships have tanked. And that is extremely important, because without fixing the neighborhood, I think it doesn't make sense for India to look beyond, right? India's key priorities lies in its immediate and extended neighborhoods. And things are not all that great there on that front. When I say the neighborhood relationships have tanked, I specifically mean countries like Nepal, China, and of course the all-weather sort of nemesis Pakistan, right? But the fact that relationships with Nepal and China have deteriorated fast should be a cause for concern for India. Even before the pandemic hit, there was a lot of pushbacks from the neighborhood, not just from Nepal and China, but also from countries like Sri Lanka and Bhutan and Bangladesh over India's domestic policies and the repercussions that the domestic policies could have on foreign relations. So that is not something that particularly the COVID-19 pandemic has brought about, but it's certainly that the COVID-19 pandemic has only accelerated those developments, right? Secondly, there is no doubt that India's international image has taken a hit over the past 1 year. Once again, the pandemic has only amplified that. Now, why I say that, why I say particularly past 1 year, is because since the current Narendra Modi government came to power in May 2019, for the second straight time, it has taken certain steps, certain domestic policy steps that have not gone down well with the international community. For instance, the abrogation of Article 370, the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act, then the Northeast Delhi riots, and then when the pandemic came, the sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric that we saw coming in from social media, Indian users on social media, especially in the Gulf. We have seen pushbacks from the international community against India's decisions in the past 1 year. And these are very significant pushbacks. These are the kind of pushbacks and the kind of language from the international community that we hadn't seen for a very long time. The United Nations has spoken up a lot of times. Foreign governments have warned over democratic pushback or democratic deficit in India. There's talk of sanctions against Indian leaders. So I think that is where our soft power has suffered greatly. And that is something that the Indian government would ignore only to its own sort of peril, right? So when we talk about the post-COVID phase, I think it's important to also note this downslide in India's image based on the democratic deficits that are very conspicuous in today's political context. The last thing that has happened so far, which is very visible at the moment, is that India-China relations have rapidly deteriorated, which is both surprising and not, given that the two leaders, Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping, have met on two occasions in two informal summits in Wuhan and Mamallapuram. But clearly, those did not have any significant impact, or they did not do significantly to mend relations or bring India-China relationships into a so-called new era, which was being talked about, right? New era of friendship and harmony. Our border relations, our border equations have, as I said, deteriorated rapidly, and what we are noticing today is, in a way, unprecedented in at least 40 to 50 decades. This is very worrying, and this is not something that's going to go away very soon. And in India must be wary of the Chinese thinking in terms of the border affairs and in terms of their agenda of expansionism. So these are sort of the key developments that reflect certain broader patterns that India has taken or is following in the last couple of months in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Beyond these relations, beyond these equations which directly concern China, I think India should also be aware of the broader geopolitical dynamics or the rapidly evolving geopolitical order, which includes, for instance, rapidly deteriorating in US-China relationships. India has always been sort of trapped in this dilemma of which bloc to side with. So far, it has largely stuck to the non-alignment framework. However, it's a cause for concern that Washington and Beijing are in a sort of historic low. It makes India's job of doing diplomacy tougher because it forces India to choose a neat side, which India cannot afford to do at the moment. In a sense, what we are witnessing today in terms of the border pushbacks from China could be a result of India's over-reliance on Washington or India's attempt to build a so-called counter-China alliance in the Indo-Pacific. All of these relationships, all of these events are interlinked, and one has a direct repercussion on the other. Now, it must be noted that during the pandemic, India has definitely moved closer to the US. As I said, this includes, in terms of medical diplomacy, inviting Trump for a massive ceremony. Now, these are things which obviously tend to get noticed by adversarial powers, most prominently China, and therefore India should be wary of the kind of choices that it makes, right? And this shows the current developments show that that India must cautiously navigate its relationships and not over rely on any particular bloc. It in fact re-emphasizes sort of the endearing importance of the non-alignment framework, right? In relation to this, I think one development that should be noted, which has happened, or so to say not happened, is that the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which currently includes India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, the Quad has largely been silent on Chinese aggression on our borders, except the US, which has clearly condemned it, and also has condemned the death of 20 Indian soldiers. The other members have largely been silent, at least through official channels. This drives home the point that that an alliance like Quad, which was pitched to be a strong counter-China alliance in many ways, although that was never officially mentioned in any memo, the fact that this alliance was built, I think the members need to reevaluate where their priorities lie, right? That in times of a crisis, how can such an alliance respond? Because an alliance is as good as what it does during a moment of crisis, right? That's what alliances are meant for, to provide a safety net in times of extraordinary developments, right? Now, what could happen after the COVID-19 pandemic? As I mentioned earlier, I don't want to dwell much upon this section because it could border upon wild speculation, right? So, which I don't want to do really. Although a lot of foreign policy analysis is precisely that, wild speculations. But I would like to stick to certain specific developments and patterns, right? Now, but still, there are two broad things that could happen after the COVID-19 pandemic, which are directly relevant to India. One, as I mentioned earlier, there could be a rise in protectionism across the world. Countries might start shielding, sort of building a fence around their national economies to prevent things like foreign investments, greater flow of trade, right? This will directly affect the smoothness or the pace of international trade, and more importantly, international labor movements or labor flows. This is important for India because India is primarily a labor sending country. It's a labor export economy rather than a labor import economy. We send a lot of both skilled and unskilled working force, particularly to countries in the Gulf and to a large extent the United States. And in return, we get a lot of remittance, which also adds significantly to our GDP. Now it's natural that even when the first phase of the pandemic is over, I mean, I hope I don't have to say first phase, there's only one phase, but when the pandemic is over, it's natural that our workers will hesitate to go out, right? To go out and work in countries like the Gulf or the United States. Of course, a lot of them would go out because of compulsions, but there will be a disruption in labor movements, and that's significantly going to, hamper our labor export economy, because it's not just an economic benefit that we get; it's also a soft power benefit. The reason why the international community, particularly the global North, may value India is, amongst other things, because of its labor force, right? Or quote unquote cheap labor, right? So that's significantly going to be hampered, at least in the short to medium term, right? The second thing that's going to happen, that's also directly related to the events that we're seeing today, is that it's sort of a good thing that's going to happen. It's on both good and both good and bad side. Is that that the broader anti-China alliance or counter-China alliance building, the pace of that is going to accelerate. There are a few reasons for that. Most prominently because of, in a way, rising anti-China sentiments around the world because of its perceived failure to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, and because it was a source of the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, the latitude that countries have to build a counter-China alliance is widening, it's broadening, right? And we are seeing that very clearly, for starters, in the Indo-Pacific domain, right? More and more Indo-Pacific countries are taking a clearer stance against China, despite the fact that China has invested significant amount of money in the broader Indo-Pacific region under the Belt and Road framework, right? But this is something that's going to happen, and India must take full advantage of this. India had already started building, sort of initiating a counter-China framework in the Indo-Pacific. The COVID-19 pandemic widens that space, in short, right? Thirdly, which is something that I had already mentioned, but I must also re-emphasize that India's neighborhood relations, despite the fact that India initiated a SARC meeting, India's neighborhood relations will grow more and more volatile and unpredictable, particularly in context of the pushbacks we are seeing from, of course, China, but also countries like Nepal. The Kalapani dispute, the border map dispute, and China and the Nepalese parliament officially endorsing a map that includes Indian territories. This is something that's not going to go away very soon, and it'll be a difficult topic to negotiate. China will also sustain military pressure or strategic pressure on our borders, because of the fact that China feels that its reputation or global reputation or its image of strength has taken a huge hit because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's going to be very reactionary, and it's only going to accelerate its revisionist and expansionist tendencies. Because please note that China is not just poking India, it's also poking other countries to its western flank. For instance, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan. China has been conducting, in the last 2-3 days, in fact, China has conducted several military and air drills over the skies of Taiwan, and very close to the territorial waters of Japan, and very close to disputed islands like the Senkaku Islands, and also undisputed islands like the Okinawa Islands. It has sent its aircraft carriers very close to the Okinawa Islands in the Mayu Strait, which has naturally caused quite a fair bit of alarm on the Japanese side. So what we see is that China is very eager to project strength at this moment, so that it is not perceived as a weak power in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? That's the basic context. And it is within this context that China will continue to apply pressure, strategic pressure across the line of control, right? The fact that the line of control is not a definitive border makes it actually worse for India, right? Now, what should India do, right? That's a $1 million question, but Again, I would like to stick to certain specifics that that we personally have been looking at an institutional capacity and also my personal capacity. Before everything, India must fix its neighborhood relationships. It must be absolute priority for New Delhi to ensure that the pushbacks or the resistance, in a way, the disturbances in its immediate neighborhood are quelled, so that there is a fair bit of stability in the South Asian regional order, right? Only after that India can afford to go outside the region. I'm not saying India should cut off relations or stop focusing on other areas, but if India doesn't fix its own neighborhood, its credibility as a South Asian power will take a major hit, which will also ultimately have an effect on things like securing a permanent UNSC seat, right? As I said, so what do I exactly mean when I say India should fix its neighborhood relationships, right? India should, particularly for starters, focus on fixing its relationships with Nepal. Because Nepal is so far we have had fairly good fraternal relationships with Nepal. And the kind of noise that we are hearing from Kathmandu today is extremely worrying, because it signifies a yawning distance between two very, very, very close powers, right? And being a buffer state, so-called buffer state, is extremely important for India to ensure that, if not completely on our side, that Kathmandu does not feel discontent with how we are doing diplomacy or our policies, right? The Kalapani border dispute, the territorial dispute, is a very, very difficult topic to broach. It has become a very difficult topic to broach in the current context. But I think India should be open to making some concessions. I am saying this for a specific reason, because in this particular case, what we have found is that without both sides, not just India, without both sides making some concessions, resolution of the dispute will become very, very difficult, right? Now, making concessions with China is a different thing. I'm saying particularly in the case of with regard to Nepal, because with Nepal we have a very special relationship, right? And we don't want to lose that. Secondly, of course, we should continue our diplomatic channels with China, because a constant border dispute, that to a violent border dispute, is in no one's interest, least of all India's, right? It's of course far more difficult to suggest a reconciliatory pathway with Pakistan, but whatever groundwork we have built so far, whatever negotiation channels we have, those must be sustained. It's far more difficult to contain the ceasefire violations across the LOC, but India should not give up the diplomatic channels with even Pakistan, right? Because ultimately there is no replacement to diplomacy, and we do not want a two-front full-fledged war, right? That's the last thing we want in a post-COVID scenario, where our focus must predominantly lie on economic and social recovery, right? The other thing is that India must focus on its extended neighborhood. Now, what do I mean by extended neighborhood? In this particular case, I particularly mean the eastern flank, which is Southeast Asia. Here I must mention the fact that since the Modi government came to power in 2014, India has built has built very solid relationships with ASEAN powers. India already had good understanding with ASEAN powers, but the re-christening of the Lucist policy to the Actist policy has actually achieved a lot on the ground. We have put more investments in projects in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries have reciprocated well. We have also initiated things like the Delhi Dialogue, which is the Indo-ASEAN dialogue framework, or Indo-ASEAN Summit. We have engaged actively with BIMSTEC, which includes Myanmar and Thailand, two very key ASEAN countries. Hence, we should not lose that momentum that we have built over the last 5 years. Southeast Asia is an extremely important but underrated foreign policy priority for us. And fortunately, the Modi government had realized that, right? And it's done everything to fix that. The COVID-19 pandemic has naturally disrupted a lot of those relationships. Our Act East policy almost has ground to a halt at the moment, but it's extremely important for New Delhi to revive those relationships. One of the ways to do that, for starters, would be to initiate a SARC-like video conference with two organizations, which is BIMSTEC and ASEAN. Now, it'll be much more difficult to initiate something like that with ASEAN because, of course, India is not a member of ASEAN, but simply a dialogue partner. But India could definitely start with with BIMSTEC. Because BIMSTEC also, as I mentioned earlier, BIMSTEC also includes Myanmar and Thailand, right? And Thailand is a very influential ASEAN partner. So BIMSTEC is a good entryway, has always been a good entryway to ASEAN for India. And India must constantly emphasize on that. Not doing that would actually mean losing all the significant groundwork or all the significant sort of sort of the work that India had done over the last 5 years with both BIMSTEC and ASEAN. This comes from the fact that if, as a country, as a so-called regional power like India, helps other countries, in this particular case, I mean ASEAN, at the time of a crisis, that matters a lot, particularly at the time of a crisis, because countries do remember these things, right? Not just the governments, the people also remember these things. Now, we must remember that although India has scaled up its outreach to ASEAN, India still faces a big credibility deficit at a popular and institutional level in ASEAN countries. Now, this is something that I have realized with my conversations with representatives from ASEAN countries, is that they want India to take a major role in ASEAN, or not ASEAN, in Indo-Pacific or the larger Indian Ocean region, but they do not believe that India has the financial or logistical capacity to do that, right? This pandemic is a good window of opportunity for India to showcase that India does not only make promises, but also has the capacity and the wherewithal to actually implement and actualize its promises, right? And that would matter a lot in the long term. India, for instance, India already has good working relationships with the CLMV countries, which is Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. This is particularly important in context of the COVID-19 pandemic because a large part of this relationship is actually hinged, a lot of us might not know that, is primarily hinged on pharmaceutical industry. You would be surprised to know that within Cambodia, for instance, a majority of Cambodia's pharmaceutical industry is actually hinged on Indian pharmaceutical companies, right? India is also planning, has also planned a lot of quick impact projects related to healthcare and pharma in countries like Myanmar. So the proposition that I'm making here is that India must expand that framework in the medium to long term, right? Because the CLMV countries are within the ASEAN countries, the CLMV countries lie in the closest proximity to India. So our interests with those countries are far higher than the distant ASEAN countries like Philippines or Indonesia or Singapore or Malaysia, for instance, right? So in the medium to long term, India must focus on building a bilateral healthcare framework with the CLMV countries, amongst other things. The other thing that India must do in this phase is actively take steps to fix its image. Now, why do I say image? I mean, image is a very abstract term. Perhaps more specific term would be soft power, right? A lot of India's soft power hinges not just on, as I mentioned earlier, not just on economic factors like a huge market, a huge domestic market, or a huge source of cheap labor, but also on the fact that India is a democratic, secular, and pluralistic country, right? Especially for the global north, these things matter a lot, right? India must take genuine steps, to reverse this perception that there is a democratic deficit in India. To a large extent, there is a democratic deficit in India that we have been noticing over the past 5 years. the government must take genuine policy steps at a domestic level to fix that. At the same time, India must behave transparently with the international community. For instance, what India has started doing a lot in the past 2-3 years is arbitrarily dismiss reports that come from international community, for instance, the United Nations or other governments. Instead of arbitrarily dismissing those reports, it would be better for India to engage with them more transparently, which also helps India build accountability, right? So it can gap the trust deficit that India has with other countries. We tend to underplay the role of soft power or image in international relations, but it is definitely important in ensuring sort of a continuity and stability in our foreign policy framework, right? Very importantly, we must note that this time the pushback is not just coming from the global north or the west. It's also coming from countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman in the west. Now, these are very crucial geoeconomic and geostrategic partners of India. We send a lot of labor force to these countries. We have good sort of counter-terrorism collaboration with these countries, for instance. And of course, most importantly, a lot of India's energy interests or oil interests lies in this country. So we just cannot afford to, alienate these countries in the Gulf particularly. But the good thing is that India, during the COVID-19 pandemic, has also ramped up its medical diplomacy with the Gulf countries. It has supplied HCQ medicines, it has supplied other medical gear, it has supplied medical teams, deployed medical teams in the Gulf countries. So I think there is also that, offsetting factor that India must build upon now, right? In order to at least make these countries believe that it's not all hostility and social hatred. That India can also play a constructive role in sort of regional collaboration or multilateralism, right? The other thing that India must do, which is I had already mentioned that, but it's something that India must focus on a priority basis, is ramp up its Indo-Pacific diplomacy, right? As I argued earlier that Chinese aggressionism is of course bad for border stability or regional stability, but it's good for India's larger foreign policy interests because it increases the space, it widens the space for India to build a counter-China alliance. More and more countries are seeing through Chinese expansionism and Chinese aggression, right? Because for the last 5 years, since Xi Jinping came to power and since the BRI was initiated in 2014, India was facing considerable headwinds and difficulty in building relationships with its regional powers because China was occupying that space, right? China was supplying a lot of resources, supplying big ticket projects to smaller and medium countries, small powers and medium powers. So the space for India to intervene was getting saturated, right? That might change and that opens up space for India to make constructive interventions, but India must not do what it is infamous for, which is make promises and then not implement them, or implement them over very long deadlines, right? India must be fast, India must be precise, and India must formulate its projects according to the specific needs of the countries rather than its own needs, right? This also entails understanding the exact perceptions about India in these particular countries, right? If there is a problem, if there's a problematic perception, or if there's a negative perception about India in, for instance, let's say Myanmar, India must not ignore that. India must address that actively. I say this because New Delhi has often tend to overlook these things and just push its diplomacy and developmental projects into these countries. Ultimately, they have failed, right? So India, this perception building, credibility building, and implementation of projects has to go hand in hand, right? The last thing that I actually want to discuss before we go into the discussion or the Q&A is what is being talked about a lot currently, which is, should India boycott China? I think it's a question that was like initiate an economic boycott of China. I think it was a question that was also discussed yesterday. Now, the crux of the matter is that India simply cannot comprehensively initiate any economic boycott of China, because the Chinese, this is where probably I'll quickly show, I need not do much explanation because the graphs are pretty much, the data is pretty much self-explanatory. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share a few graphs which will make it clear why it's not feasible for India's end to even, think about in the short term a complete economic boycott of China, right? Okay, can you see this? Okay. Okay. Right. So if you see this here, this is the first graph actually gives an idea of Chinese foreign direct investments into India from 2005 to 2019. What you will see is it's only, 2007 was a particularly, sort of good year for Chinese investments in India. But what you'll see is it's consistently, steadily, but surely going up. Chinese investments in India at the moment, the last fiscal term in 2019 was to the tune of 4.14 billion US dollars, right? That's a massive amount. The only higher investment in a single year that happened was in 2007, which was 5.08. So you see, there's a significant amount of Chinese FDI in India, right? And this kind of FDI is not just sort of straightforward money coming into Indian companies, but it also includes a lot of secondary investments and secondary and tertiary investments, right? Now, if you see this India-China trade, the basic summary of this is the fact that India has a huge trade deficit with China. We import much more than we export. And when I say much more, I mean much more in terms of the ratio. If you see in the last fiscal year term, in the 2019-20 period, the red line shows the Chinese imports into India, or Indian imports from China. And the blue line shows Indian exports to China. So we are buying much more from China than we are selling, which is not good news for India. Such a trade deficit, such a huge trade deficit takes a long time to be bridged, right? And it cannot happen in even the medium term, right? As you see, India, these are the countries that India imports from. China is still the single largest importer country from where we import, right? Which is 14.09%. The other small red line that you see is actually Hong Kong. So combining China and Hong Kong, even China, mainland China single-handedly constitutes the biggest country source of imports for our products. And these are the countries where we import from, where we export to. And China, as you see, doesn't actually occupy a significant chunk of this pie, right? We in fact export to other countries much more than we do to China, right? Now, this is interesting because this also is to do with a lot of, the noise that we are hearing today from domestic quarters as to boycott Chinese phones, throw Chinese TVs from balconies and all of that. If you see, these are the different graphs that you should see, the different colors are the different cell phone companies in India, right? Smartphone companies in India. Now, if you see, Xiaomi alone occupies, if you see the last quarter, just a second, it's getting hid. In the last quarter, Xiaomi itself occupies 30% of the market share of the smartphone industry in India. And 30% is a huge deal, right? Even the company which occupies the next largest share is Samsung on an average. But the next three companies are also Chinese: Vivo, Oppo, and Realme, right? So in such a situation, even if you talk to industry leaders who might support the idea of a Chinese boycott in light of recent events, even they will tell you that it's simply not feasible to initiate a comprehensive Chinese boycott or boycott of Chinese products, because the market is way too saturated with Chinese products, right? And the smartphone graph, I show you the smartphone graph because smartphone is something that all of us have an access to. We might not have a TV or any other things, but smartphones are something that all of us use. So in a way, Chinese investments have almost become a part of our daily life without us realizing so. Forget about the smartphone companies. Check this out. actually, I don't have the graph for that. But beyond the smartphone companies, China has a lot of secondary and tertiary investments in apps like Zomato, Baiju's, Flipkart, Ola. So these are apps that most of us use on a daily basis, right? So cutting off Chinese investments would basically essentially entail us stopping the usage of these apps. But there's a silver lining to this, right? Um, just a second. Yeah. So the silver lining here is that India is a major pharmaceutical sort of exporter to the United States, and such a period of a pandemic is actually a great time to ramp up sales of pharmaceutical products. But within that silver lining, also China is a big exception. If you see, these are India's API imports. So API actually means active pharmaceutical ingredients, right? So although India is a major pharmaceutical exporter, we still import a lot of the pharmaceutical ingredients from China. Do you see how we're trapped in this huge dilemma of whether to boycott or not? Because all rational sort of data and the empirical evidence shows us that it's difficult for India to boycott anything, even pharmaceutical. Essentially, without these APIs, India would stop being the largest exporter of pharmaceutical products. The last graph that I want to show you is tourism. The blue the blue bar that you see are tourists from India to China. The red bar that you see are tourists from China to India. You see the massive difference. We send out a lot more tourists, but we get comparatively much lesser tourists from China. It essentially adds to the trade deficit. We are adding significantly to China's economy, but Chinese tourists are not adding to our economy. So what we see here is actually like a multidimensional, in a sense, a multidimensional threat or dimension in a way which sort of hinders India's capacity to initiate an economic boycott of China, right? So I think this is, I've spoken a lot. I think this is where I will end, and I'm sure I would actually love to hear questions and thoughts from the audience on other aspects that I've spoken about directly in my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Anshuman. It was indeed a very enlightening session in many aspects. You have quoted a lot of examples, and you have also shown us that you have done a extensive research on this subject matter. Though it is just a topic of last 3 months of discussions, because if we talk about post-COVID-19, but still we could all relate to it, because I feel Indian foreign policy is changing in the last governments under Mr. Narendra Modi. There are a lot of strategic changes that we are making, and I think the same kind of changes are going to happen in future too. So you have definitely taken us on a journey to understand how India's relationship is changing, some of the challenges that we have, and probably we shouldn't boycott any nation in this atmosphere. We should strengthen ourselves and move ahead, so that we can play a crucial role in creating India's place in South Asia, as well as a third world nation, but as a strong economy, right? So I feel you had pointed out many things that are changing today, and there are many questions that would come up. So I would be happy to receive the questions on your behalf, and if they would like to ask it directly, also I can connect you. So thank you, sir, for presenting your insight in it.
Thank you.
And your wonderful graphs were also very much, as you said, they speak their own tale. So instead of simply passing on WhatsApp messages of boycotting all apps, which probably may not lead to anything, we can focus on strengthening ourselves. So if you are talking about Atmanirbhar now, better focus on that first rather than boycotting others. So because in the globalized world, probably it is not feasible for any nation to boycott another nation. We have not learned to survive alone. And we are now used to live in this world where we expect apples to come from New Zealand, we expect our foreign policy decisions taken in another continent. So the session is now open for discussion. I'm sure Anshuman would be able to answer a lot of questions that are coming up. So like yesterday, if you'd like to ask a question, kindly raise hands, and you can also type your question in the chat box. So I have the first question from Mr. Raj Kumar. I shall unmute you, sir.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. Ma'am, good afternoon, ma'am. Sir, really, we enjoyed and know the real thing what's happening in India without that gimmicks of words. Okay, my question is, where we have missed our economy, that's from exporter to importer, and what are the strategy we need to follow in coming days to overcoming economically, financially, and defensively dominated in our South Asian region.
Should I answer that?
Sure, sir. You
Yes,
can.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, that's, I would say, the question and answer. The question and the mandate of this question is very ambitious, because we must remember that that the economic downturn or downslide that we are seeing in India today, it's not actually just because of COVID-19. The downslide had begun before COVID-19 hit us, right? Our GDP was nearing a 0% growth rate. Some economists even said that our GDP was already in recession or negative growth. We had a negative growth rate even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. So India has a very ambitious mandate, or very difficult mandate, I would say, in front of it, now that the COVID-19 pandemic has in fact worsened the situation, right? In terms of economic recovery, the one thing that I want to emphasize on is that, as ma'am just mentioned, in a globalized world, it's not feasible to initiate things like economic boycott and stuff, right? The age of economic boycotts is over, right? What India must focus on at the moment is gaining advantage in competitive global value chains, right? Now that can happen through collaboration, greater physical connectivity, which would translate to greater trade links, right? We often tend to underplay the importance of collaborative / regional economic recovery mechanisms, but they can be extremely important, right? This also comes back to your sub-question about what should India do in the South Asian context, right? Now, my argument is that India must singularly focus on building smooth physical connectivity across South Asia, right? Because without physical connectivity, trade is simply impossible. And the last 20-30 years proves that, right? South Asia, we have a lot of cultural similarities. We have a lot of we share a certain historical legacy, but counterintuitively, our physical connectivity and trade links are very disrupted. They're very weak, right? Now, this has always been a problem, but India must use this COVID-19 pandemic to accelerate or amplify or sort of strengthen South Asian relationships, trading relationships. Let's be a little more specific, right? I already spoke about that in terms of India initiating a BIMSTEC meeting, right? Now, a large part of this BIMSTEC framework should focus on economic recovery, a joint economic recovery, because all the BIMSTEC powers are important, sort of crucial trading partners and trading partners of India, right? So, and the COVID-19 pandemic has led to closed borders and obviously, naturally, a lesser flow of cross-border traffic. India must ensure that its trading links and physical connectivity with these countries, the existing physical connectivities with these countries are restored, firstly, and secondly, new connectivities are built. This also includes a country like Myanmar, which is our quote-unquote land bridge to Southeast Asia. It's literally our entry gateway to the ASEAN region, right? So I think in that sense, the domestic stimulus package that the government has announced has its own role to play. I'm not going to go into that because that's not my expertise. But what I want to focus on is that a regional economic recovery plan should be initiated. And the fact is that there is already significant groundwork on that. BIMSTEC already has a framework, right? It already has a framework to pool resources of different countries and allocate them accordingly, right? This also includes resource allocation into healthcare. You would be delighted to know that Thailand, which is a BIMSTEC member, is actually the lead country within BIMSTEC within the healthcare vertical, public healthcare vertical. And Thailand has been, relatively far more successful than other countries in the region in containing the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a lot of best practices that BIMSTEC can pick up from Thailand and pass on to other countries. And there's a lot of, as I said, best practices that India can also directly pick up from Thailand, right?
Wonderful, sir. Yes. Many questions are coming up.
Sure.
I think it's time for Nidil Prakash Nair to ask the question. Yes, Nidil, please ask.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for such an enlightening experience, and as a result, I'm left with a lot of questions. Firstly, the fact that India's neighbors turn hostile could also mean that the balance of power is shifting towards India's favor. And secondly, isn't it more practical?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Isn't that the fact that India's neighbors turn hostile could also mean that the balance of power is shifting towards India's favor?
Right. Okay, I'm a little confused about this. If the country is turning hostile towards India, why? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm asking a counter question because just so that I can answer your question. Why do you believe if countries are hostile towards India, then the balance of power is shifting in favor of India?
May I interrupt? I think this is a follow-up of yesterday's discussion when Professor said the more powerful the nation becomes, the more enemy their neighbors would be.
Right.
So Nitin is asking whether probably that's the reason you have to think the hostility is growing just to mean that we are becoming more powerful.
Right. Sure. Please go ahead with the other question, please.
Yes. Nidil, please ask the next question.
Isn't it more practical and realistic for India to come out of the non-alignment framework and side with a particular bloc like the US to help fight the Chinese expansionist policies?
Thank you.
Okay. Right. I actually don't ascribe to the first theory that hostility from the neighborhood actually means the balance of power is shifting in India's favor, because the context here is very specific. In Nepal's context, it's not a secret that Kathmandu started becoming more and more hostile towards India after the communist coalition came to power and sort of became closer to China, right? It is also not a secret that there has been Chinese prodding towards Nepal, particularly in terms of the border issues, to maintain this pressure on India, right? This is also got to do with the fact that for the longest time, China was in a way urging India to become a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it had even urged India, proposed a certain trilateral framework between India, Nepal, and China. They were actually planning to build a rail link through mainland China, Nepal, and into India, which India flatly declined, right? What we see today are reactions to those kind of things, right? So I don't particularly believe that means that the power is shifting in favor of India. I would actually argue to the contrary, right? That China is successfully able to rally around our neighborhood to maintain a sort of pressure on India, right? This particularly is important in context of the fact that India never, in this particular century, while India has seen, in this particular past 2 decades, India has seen significant economic growth, but China's economic growth and geopolitical growth is far more aggressive and faster, right? So I don't think, I would at least say it's too early to arrive at that conclusion. right? The second part of your question, no, I do not believe it's prudent for India to choose a particular bloc. I would still hinge on the non-alignment framework. Now, what is interesting to note is that our Prime Minister Narendra Modi also initiated a non-alignment meeting recently, right? That is very noteworthy because we had gotten a sense that India's diplomacy under Narendra Modi is going to be different from India's diplomacy under the Nehruvian framework, right? Even our foreign minister's speech last year, earlier this year, sort of made it clear that India is going to do diplomacy differently, right? But the fact that our Prime Minister did resort to a time-tested framework of non-alignment shows that India cannot ever truly eschew that framework. Because if you see India's geostrategic position on the map of the world, it sits next to a hyper-aggressive, expansionist and revanchist power like China. The cost of us siding with the United States, which has under Trump been very ambivalent, is extremely high, which simply cannot afford to take sides in this particular case, because then we can expect more border clashes, then we can expect far more sort of economic pressure from China, and also more pushbacks from our own neighborhood. So I don't think it's prudent to do that.
Yes, sir. Thank you for very clear. There are three more people with raised hands. So I'll go with Miss Madhura. Madhura?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Sir, I have two questions.
Can you please introduce yourself and then ask the question so that you would know?
So,
yes.
Yeah, I'm from St. Joseph's College, Bangalore. I'm doing my second year undergraduation. So I have two questions. The first one is, what are your thoughts on Atmanirbhar policy that the current government has introduced? And can we call China's continuous economic influence in Nepal, Pakistan, and other countries, and subsequent introduction of Mandarin and Chinese philosophies in schools, be called modern colonization?
Okay. Good.
Very interesting questions. Actually, in terms of the Atmanirbhar policy, it's largely a domestic policy. So I would not, comment too much on it because it lies outside my expertise. But I will only comment on the, let's say, the international, global, or foreign policy aspect of it. Now, Atmanirbhar essentially means self-dependent, right? Or in a sense, let's say, become economically autonomous, right? One of the basic ingredients or one of the basic requirements of a policy of self-dependence is an economy which is oil well and healthy, right? That there's a bare minimum of, let's say, strength in the economy so that we can, while becoming Atmanirbhar, which is while shifting production to India, that we can at least have a safety net or a cushioning to sort of, cushioning against short-term losses that come out of cutting off global links, right? But the crude reality of today is that we do not have that cushioning. Our economy is already in shambles, unfortunately, right? When the economy is in such a state, abruptly shifting to a policy of self-dependence would mean cutting off critical global links, right? And shifting production to India in a context which is very volatile, right? We don't even know if companies are fully willing to shift their production basis to India. Of course, they're moving out of China in particular cases, but are they willing to come to India? That's still not clear, right? And this also goes back to the graphs that I showed. I mean, China is just the biggest example, but there are other examples also, that in a globalized world, it doesn't make much sense to singularly emphasize on self-dependence. Of course, we should focus on building indigenous capabilities, indigenous manufacturing capabilities, but that does not mean cutting off links from the outside world. I mean, this is something that the Prime Minister also made clear, but I think the specificity within this fact is that it's possible to become self-reliant while also being connected to global value chains. And I will repeat what I said earlier. It's not really about becoming self-dependent. It's actually, in today's world, it's about gaining advantage in the competitive global value chains. right? So that is all I'm going to say. In terms of Chinese colonialism and sort of teaching Mandarin and stuff, well, that's a recent pattern, that emerging pattern that we have been noticing, and it's a very real thing actually. It's not something that exists only in speculation or conspiracy books, right? In fact, as part of its BRI framework, China has been building, for instance, training workshops in other countries where they're also giving Mandarin training. Now, the logic that they give is very utilitarian. They say that the workers need to learn Mandarin so that they can communicate well with our workers, like workers of foreign countries, right? But you see how ultimately it becomes sort of a cultural intervention or a cultural influence, right? So this is a framework that China has been following to push its own cultural agenda through a predominantly geo-economic agenda, which is very different from the so-called American imperialism or expansionism that we saw over the last 5-6 decades. It was mostly based on military dominance, right? Military dominance and pop culture dominance through soft power, right? What China is focusing on is pushing money and then pushing the culture, right? And it's doing very cleverly through things like BRI projects. So yeah, it's a real thing, but I would say it's very early to discern a clear pattern. There is an emerging pattern, but it's still early to discern a pattern across the board.
Okay, thank you. So I think her question is being answered, Madhura. So probably as saying, China is the neo-colonialist power of today, right? Okay. So Murshana, Miss Murshana has a question. I have unmuted you, Murshana.
Yes, hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi, I'm Murchana and I'm a psychologist, but I have a lot of interest in international relations, so that's why I'm attending this. I have one question, that is, what is the importance of India's foreign policy with African nations during during COVID-19 and also post COVID-19? Because we have a lot of maritime ports there, and also in the economic forum, we have a lot of exports which has been done to African nations, and we have a lot of businessmen in fact going to Africa and putting up their economic their businesses there. So I just want to know more about it.
Thanks for the question. It's actually I'm grateful you asked that question, because probably I had sort of missed this part in terms of the changing priorities or India's foreign policy priorities. Look, India in the last 3-4 years under Narendra Modi has actually proactively tried to build relationships with Africa through things like the India-Africa Growth Corridor, which also has significant Japanese involvement. Now, why is Africa important? There's a singular reason, which is South-South cooperation, a space that India has significant potential to lead. It's the kind of initiative that India as an important power in the global South can sort of lead and maintain, right? This is even more important because Africa doesn't only have Indian interventions or Indian influence. There's huge amount of Chinese interventions in Africa, massive. In fact, the reality is that India doesn't really have an exclusive port in Africa, contrary to what we believe. The only two exclusive ports, deep sea ports that India has, which can be used for extensive geo-economic and geostrategic purposes, are the Chabahar port in Iran and the Duqm port in Oman. India tried to procure a port in Seychelles, but that was stalled because the opposition party in Seychelles was very worried about, Chinese, basically China getting angry at India that they're allowing India to build a port in Seychelles. We do have some small time, listening posts and maritime posts in countries like Madagascar and Seychelles also. But the point here is that India must not solely focus on a maritime strategy. It has to be geo-economic and geostrategic both, right? Because even African countries, we must remember, we must not take them for granted. Even they will assess the cost-benefit analysis of the costs and benefits of singularly align with China versus singularly align with India versus align with China. Because fact is that China has already pushed a lot of big ticket investments into countries like Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, even Seychelles, Madagascar, Djibouti. The Djibouti port, I think around 60% of the port exclusively belongs to China now. Right. So India must note that China already has made significant gains when it comes to relationships with Africa. So what India should do, in fact, is focus actually on the India-Africa growth corridor, which India hasn't been focusing much in the last 1 to 2 years. India must revive the focus on the India-Africa growth corridor, because that can actually become a viable alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And India and Japan already have good working relationships with African countries. I think it makes sense to only build on those. In the post-pandemic phase, particularly, India can significantly help African countries improve their public healthcare system, supply medicines, and also provide technocratic assistance in terms of pre-disease surveillance, laboratory networking, and other things. So I think geoeconomic investments and geoeconomic interventions mixed with targeted pandemic-related assistance is what India should do with Africa at the moment.
Thank you, Anshuman sir. The next question is sent in the chat box by Mr. Pranay, a student of history. And he's asking about, are we going to see more of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea? If it's so, would it add more pressure in the international level? And in what way our international attitude towards China can be influenced by this?
Right. Yes. The simple answer is yes. We are going to see more aggression, Chinese aggression on the South China Sea. Probably not just the South China Sea, but also the East China Sea, and very close to the Japanese territorial waters. If the events of the last 3-4 days are any indication, then this is clear that China is willing to sustain some kind of military pressure or geostrategic pressure on its eastern flank. As I said earlier, that China is extremely conscious of the fact that its global reputation or the perception of strength has taken a hit because of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's why it will be very much more eager than usual to project power across all flanks, not just the western flank in the borders of India, but also the eastern flank. Now, the new security law in Hong Kong, then the Chinese statement about forcefully annexing Taiwan, these things are all must all be seen in this context, right? China is not giving up on South China Sea anytime soon, because that would be very counterintuitive to their own strategy, which they have been following over the last decade, at least. It will actually, from Chinese point of view, it will actually diminish all the gains that they have gained, the strategic gains that they have gained. But at the same time, relating to the second part of the question, at the same time, greater Chinese belligerence or greater Chinese aggression, more visible Chinese aggression, actually gives India an incentive to widen its counter-China coalition. This particularly means that certain Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Philippines, who are very ambivalent about countering China, even within ASEAN, will now become more vocal. Right? This is good news for India, because now India can actually build a more coherent framework, right, to counter China. So I think, yeah, it's both good and bad. But the simple answer is that yes, China is going to maintain or even amplify its military pressure on South China Sea, but it might have a positive consequence for India.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I have a question. Probably many have that in their mind. Is the role of United Nations need to change now? Are they maintaining too much of silence and decorum? Should there be a kind of reform in the way United Nations is going to function in future?
Right. Look, I've always believed that the current Security Council structure is just not tenable. In a multipolar world, we are no more in a unipolar or bipolar world, right? We are in a increasingly multipolar world. It simply doesn't make sense that 5 countries have have a disproportionately huge, disproportionately almost like a monopolized sway over global affairs, right? Therefore, it's very much incumbent on the United Nations to reform the Security Council, right? The non-permanent versus permanent structure is also not viable anymore, right? Countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, these are significantly emerging powers, and they deserve a spot at the table, is what I want to say. But that's what it's a catch-22 situation. It's almost like a vicious cycle. In order to do that, you need the consent of a power like China, right? Which occupies a seat at the center table. And China is not going to anytime allow countries like adversarial countries like India to get an equal share or equal say at the table, right? This also has got to do a lot with the fact that if other countries come onto the table, then China's particular hold or agenda over global affairs weakens, right? I'll give you one small example. If you, I don't know how many of you know that, but the Rohingya crisis that's underway in Myanmar, for a long time, the international community has been trying to initiate some kind of punitive action against Myanmar to change its behavior towards the Rohingya. But China has been constantly stalling it, right? So you see how these small bilateral relations between China and Myanmar ultimately come down from the very structure of the United Nations Security Council, right? It's because of China's constant vetoing down of resolutions that the international community has not been able to take action against Myanmar. And I would say rightful action against Myanmar. Myanmar and China have good BRI-related relationships, and hence China is shielding Myanmar at an international stage. And China has been doing that with other countries also. So you see how this P5 structure actually hampers not just macro global structures, but also, micro developments, micro instances like the Rohingya crisis, for instance. So my basic argument is that the P5 structure has to be dismantled. And the next closest viable structure, according to me, is a rolling center table, where there is a center table, but it's a rolling center table, where all countries get a chance to be at the table on the basis of an election, like we see currently in the United Nations Security Council, but that's to do with the non-permanent members. But there has to be a rolling basis for the permanent members also. Otherwise, the United Nations, if that doesn't happen, then the UN structure, the core UN structure, will always be very detached from the reality of the global order, which is the multipolar reality.
Okay, thank you, sir. Ms. Pooja Patil is having a question. Yes, Pooja, please ask your question. Introduce yourself, then ask your question.
Hello, sir. I'm a student of Presidency College. I'm studying my second year BA. So basically, my question is regarding the Chabar port. We know the Chabar port is present in Iran, and recently US had put sanctions on Iran, so we had to abide by it. And this is a kind of very sensitive issue, and it was a tough thing to decide on. So basically, how to deal with all these things, and what is the future of Chabar port, and how does this basically affect the India's international relation, like when such kind of things come up?
Look, I don't think there's ever a clear answer to certain questions like what should India do in such a situation, right? There are only a bunch of options that India has. There is no clear sort of definitive solution, right? As you rightly mentioned, it was a big dilemma for India actually when US imposed sanctions on Iran, because India does have a good working relationship with Iran, right? And the fact that India has an active port in Chabahar, and Iran allowed us to sort of do that is a big deal, right? So it's a very difficult sort of situation for India as to what to do. But what I would say is that global equations and global strategic dynamics or foreign policy priorities are never static, right? Today, US has applied sanctions on Iran. Tomorrow, we might see those sanctions loosen, the basic point here is that India must not give up on things like Chabar, which have come after a lot of proactive diplomacy, and has taken us a lot of sort of managing and convincing in that particular region. So it would only be against India's interests to give up on Chabahar permanently just because the United States has applied sanctions on Iran. Because, for instance, you have the US elections coming up in November, right? We see a different administration coming in Washington, DC, and that administration actually goes with the previous JCPOA framework and relaxes sanctions on Iran, right? So then the space opens up again for India to comfortably take up Chabar Port again. So my point here is that right now it's a period of flux, it's a period of dilemma, but something that I had mentioned right at the beginning of my speech, the world order is far more resilient than we make it out to be. So things, I believe, would fall in place very soon. I mean, that's all I have to say in this particular case. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's very interesting to see a lot of students asking the questions, even in the chat box. The next question is again a student from St. Joseph, Bangalore, Nashad Saik. The question is, whatever the deal is there between US and Taliban, if there is a deal, that will have many geostrategic concerns for countries like India. Is there a deal, and is there any concern for India? Is Taliban still there, or if there is a deal between Taliban and US, is that going to be a concern for India?
It's a very, very tricky question to answer, whether there is a deal between the United States and Taliban. I think it's a question, it's an answer that all of us have been looking for some time now, but failingly so. Every time there seems to be a deal, there is a pushback, right? And most of the diplomacy between Washington and Taliban is actually happening behind closed doors. It's not out in the open, right? But here's the fact. Taliban is an entity, is an influence in Afghanistan that no major power can ignore, right? It's been almost 20 years since US invaded Afghanistan and pushed Taliban eastward. Since then, Afghanistan has come a long way, but one of the things that has happened is Taliban has come back to the center stage, right? Taliban is a formidable negotiating party in the Afghan situation, in the Afghan landscape today. So much so that the very fact that US even offered a deal with an entity which it used to flatly dismiss or call a terrorist organization is a big deal, right? So even if there is no deal, there is an offer for a deal. That in itself should matter to other countries who have interest in Afghanistan, for instance, India, right? I'm sorry, could you just give me a moment?
Sure, sir.
Yeah. Sorry, there was some disruption on my end. Okay. So, yeah, so the point here is that India should definitely be wary of the Taliban presence and the let's say the political capital the Taliban has in today's Afghanistan, right? A deal, I would say, a deal between the US and Taliban would ultimately be beneficial for Indian interests, because it would also mean, subversion of certain nefarious links that Pakistan intelligence or the Pakistan deep state has with Taliban. But that is exactly the problem, right? Anytime there is a deal between, or there's a talk of a deal between Afghanistan and the Taliban, between the US and the Taliban, the Pakistan equation comes in between, right? And that is a very tricky situation to navigate. But the baseline here is that greater stability in Afghanistan, greater political and security stability for Afghanistan is good news for India, because then India can actually initiate its economic agenda, economic and developmental agenda in Afghanistan. Because fact of the matter is that Taliban continues to be an irritant in that regard.
Okay, thank you, sir. There's another question from Professor Arish, St. Joseph College. Would you like to ask the question directly, or I shall read it on his behalf as of now? Don't you think it is a better strategy for India to move closely to China, solve our differences, move closely to China, then trying continuously to strengthen our relations with Western nations? Can't we join their Belt and Road Initiative and create a multipolar world order?
I mean, the fact of the matter, as I said, I'll repeat something that I said in one of the answers to the previous question, is that it simply is not in India's interest to singularly ally with one particular bloc, right? And China is too, I would say, it's too sensitive and loaded an entity at the moment for India to ally with, right? One of the reasons why India didn't join the BRI is because of the pending territorial disputes in Gilgit-Baltistan and in that particular region, right? Because the CPEC passes through that. I don't see that territorial dispute being resolved anytime soon, especially given the current developments, right? Definitely not. The one singular self-destruction or self-damage that India would do by allying with China is that it would effectively mean cutting off relations with practically half of the world. Because the moment India clearly allies with China, it loses its Indo-Pacific alliances. It loses whatever goodwill it had with the West. And I'm not saying India should rely on the West all the time, but the influence that the West wields over the global order is a reality that India cannot ignore, right? So I think it's too much of a gamble for India to ally with China. Ideologically also speaking, we have different systems of governance. Our ideologies are different, right? We are not a country, I mean, notwithstanding the democratic deficits that we have seen in the past 5 years, we are not a country which likes to control, which likes to impose a strict across the board control over its domestic constituencies or the thought processes that come out of its citizens, right? So the basic ideology, the worldviews are different. They're incoherent. We are not a reformist or revanchist power, right? We have always pitched ourselves as a democratic reformist power. So I don't think in any measure an India-China comprehensive alliance is in the offing. Of course, we negotiate on certain things to manage the relationships and the turbulence, but no, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Sure. Yes, sir. Another question. I shall unmute Mr. Gulabni Rahmani, Afghanistan. Would you like to ask a question now, sir? Yes. Yes. We can hear you, sir. Please ask the question.
Hello, madam.
Yes, sir.
May I have a question, madam?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Can you
Thank you
please
very much.
introduce yourself and then please ask the question?
Madam, can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you.
Thank you very much for presenter. I'm from Afghanistan. This was very interesting seminar, and I got some points from the presenters. Now the US and the Taliban are negotiating for the peace in Afghanistan. And what do you think? I want to know from the presenter. What do you think? After the Taliban want to come in Afghanistan, and how much stability of peace will come in the country in Afghanistan through the Taliban negotiation and US? Do you think the Taliban and US will be honest to bring stability and peace in Afghanistan, or they are putting in the dialogues? That's all.
Right. Before I answer that question, I must clarify that I'm not an Afghanistan expert at all. Afghanistan is a very complex country. It's a hugely complex country. It's a multi-dimensional, multi-actor kind of country, right? So I would not like to dabble too much into a country that's not my expertise. But my limited sort of understanding and my reading of the situation in Afghanistan is that even if the US and Taliban manage to chalk out a deal, in the short term, it's not going to last. It's not going to be a durable deal, because we saw something similar happen last year. Earlier this year. A so-called deal was chalked out, a ceasefire at least was chalked out. Not less than a week after that, both parties started engaging, hurling weapons at each other, throwing weapons at each other, right? So the aggression began even before the deal settled down, the ceasefire settled down. So I don't think that's going to happen. The second point I want to make is that Afghanistan is not just Taliban. There are many other security actors or threats, if you may, to Afghan stability within Afghanistan or around Afghanistan. This includes entities like the Haqqani Network, the ISKP, or the Islamic State's Khorasan province wing. Then there is the Pakistani intelligence, which is itself an irritant in many ways, right? So the point is that the Taliban, and of course, the Taliban is not a monolithic identity. Let's remember that. It's split from the between, it's divided into at least 3 factions at the moment, and at least 2 factions of them do not think in the same lines. They're very contradictory sort of approaches to how to bring about stability or how to negotiate with the US, right? So when there is no internal cohesiveness within Taliban, how does the US plan to sign a comprehensive, durable deal? I don't see that, right? If it managed to do that, well and good. But my point here is that even if there is a deal, a short-term deal, there are other security threats that will continue to flare up and disturb Afghanistan. I think unless and until there is a coherent government which is confident of reigning in the various provinces, especially the southern provinces, I don't think there's going to be stability. Right now, the government itself is also, just like the Taliban, the power center is itself split. The Kabul power center is itself split. So you see there's a lot, it's all over the place. So the fact of the matter remains that it's a messy business. Negotiation in Afghanistan is a messy business. There are a lot of external and internal security interests, and peace is not going to be easy.
Yes, sir. I do have another 5 or 6 questions, but we have time to take 1 or 2 probably. So Akshita asked a question yesterday, so I'll go with Akshita now too. Akshita, can you please ask a short question, please? And by the way, thank you, sir, for joining from Afghanistan. Gulabmir Rahman, sir. Yes. Akshita,
thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, myself, Akshita Maheshwari from Sophia College, Ajmer, and I am pursuing my master's in modern Indian history. Sir, I wanted to ask one question that in your view, what should India do? Should India step back in current scenario, or should lead a war with China? What is most suitable for India?
Do you mean in particular context with China? Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay. So it might sound a bit cliche, but look, war is never an option, right? In today's world, we're in the 21st century, 2020, right? I don't think we're going to regress back to a situation where there's a full-fledged war between both countries. And this is the harsh reality.
Yes.
India's geoeconomic, geopolitical, and geostrategic clout is far lesser than China's.
Truthful statement, sir. Thank you. The last question of the day, Ms. Shrestha is asking a question. Professor Shrestha, will COVID-19 and its impact endanger this Asian century concept?
Right. I would say no. I mean, I'm giving very specific answers, but the thing is that in such foreign policy discussions, we usually get to hear abstractions, and I think
yes,
it's time.
We're very happy you're giving specific answer. Yes, sir.
Exactly. I don't think it endangers the Asian century or the Asian order. In fact, it's a great window of opportunity for the Asian order to build itself and show its true capability, right? Through collaborations, through multilateral understanding, through investments in pandemic response for the future, through investments in public healthcare, and through greater engagement, people-to-people contacts, and through greater research collaborations. I think this is the time where the Asian order, has a glaring opportunity to prove its mettle. Now, one thing that I just want to say and end this answer with that is that it's undeniable. If you see, since the COVID-19 pandemic started, the Western world, which so far was the so-called the leader of the world, the leader of the developmental agenda of the world, has actually suffered disproportionately because of the pandemic. They have actually struggled very, very hard to mount a appropriate response to the pandemic, right? Compared to that, if you see some of the Asian countries like Vietnam and Thailand, even India, of course the caseload is spiking in this country, but at least we have mounted, if not a better, but equally strong response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And think about this, there is a legitimate sort of understanding, literature on the fact that the Asian population is far more resilient to pandemics because it has already gone through a series of pandemics like the SARS pandemic in the early 2000s, right? So in some sense, there is already best practice learning. There is already a systemic resilience to pandemic response, right? Which the West doesn't have, right? So this is, in fact, this is the very moment that the Asian century will have its window of opportunity to shine.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Again, a student, so I don't want to ignore a student.
Sure.
Right, from St. Joseph, Nashan. Probably this is her assignment question, I don't know. She wants to know implication of India's recent exit from Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Right. Again, that would actually demand a very long answer, which I don't want to give right now. Yeah, but again, keeping it short and specific, I don't think the consequences are going to be very drastic. Okay. Because the thing is that India's the RCEP is certainly a very robust joint geo-economic framework. But the fact is that it's not going to add significantly to India's geo-economic relationships with ASEAN. India can still build a viable viable economic relationships or partnerships with ASEAN countries and Southeast Asian countries or East Asian countries like Japan and South Korea without also being in the RCEP, right? Because the past evidence also tells us that the FTAs that we already have an FTA with ASEAN, for example, but that FTA hasn't actually done anything, right? It hasn't. We still have a trade deficit with ASEAN, even with ASEAN, right? So I don't think these big multilateral sort of trans-regional economic partnerships are always beneficial, right? Particularly in a situation where we need to focus on our domestic economy a lot now, right? And that we are having a very, very sour time with China. It's really not a great time to be a part of RCEP, is what I feel.
Marvelous, sir. Thank you. It was really a wonderful experience to hear from you. I thank all the senior professors who have come from different parts of India, and they are very, very politely, very nicely listening to all of us. And around, I have 10 participants today. So it was marvelous that you gave your time to us. And Anshuman sir was able to clarify majority of doubts. On a formal note, since I would like to invite Professor Hemanga sir to conclude the session because it was he who invited the resource person.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yes, on my behalf, I thank each and every one of you to have joined us today, right? So over to Hemanga sir, and thank you, Anshuman sir.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of technical problem on my side, right? Because I think there's a lot of network issues or something. Am I audible still?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you, sir. Please continue.
Right. So I really want to thank Anshuman today for coming over. And like ma'am said, let me start by giving a formal thank you. And I genuinely believe like one of the best kind of attitudes that we can have towards someone is an attitude of gratitude. So today, although he's not here, Professor Subhachandran, I would actually start by thanking him for such a very lucid and crystal clear session that he gave us, which actually paved the way for today's session as well. And I just after yesterday's session, I also had a word with ma'am, and I told her to convey my regards to Professor Chandran, because as someone, as a person who's also very keen right now to know about the developments in international relations, I found the session very, very interesting. And second, coming to you, Anshuman, as a friend, as a classmate since for more than 8 years that we have known each other, 8 to 10 years, I think, but we have known each other. I have always seen you progress. I have known, and I still remember we have spoken more often than we thought that we would, maybe, and that has been a very great pleasure today that to have you finally as a resource person amidst us. And as you spoke, and as a teacher, when I was listening to many of my students ask you questions today, especially a number of my 6th semester students who actually have learned, who I taught them a paper called India and Her Neighbors. I know they must have greatly benefited from your talk today. So thank you on their behalf, and hope to see you again in number of sessions now that the world is becoming even more global by connecting us through these mediums. So I hope to see you again, and thank you again, Anshuman. Again, I would also take on record, I would like to place my thanks to the management of the college, because without the management's support, we would never be anywhere. I'm pretty sure about that. So I thank our principal, Reverend Father Jose Kutipidi, our vice principal, Reverend Dr. Augustine George, financial administrator, Reverend Father Lejo P. Thomas, and other fathers as well. And I don't know, I'm not sure if he's here right now, but our dean, a very strong pillar in our amidst us, who always like gives us positive vibes, Dr. Gopakumar AV, and Professor S.J. Michael, the department head for political science as well as social sciences and languages. I thank him. And obviously, how can I forget our very own dear Ramya ma'am, for the head of the Department of History again, for moderating brilliantly both the sessions, today's as well as yesterday's session. A very important person that I do not want to miss out in my thank you list is the tech team of our college. I know they have tremendously put in effort, and there are a number of webinars going on, but Amir sir specifically, thank you for giving us your time, your expertise.
Mr. Ajit, yes.
For giving us your expertise. And last but not the least, all our dear participants. Like before the session, I was going through the list of participants, people from mechanical engineering to chemistry to physics to history, obviously, to IR to Sanskrit, to from all over most of the states in India to Sri Lanka, Philippines, and today, like we also very actively saw a participant from Afghanistan, for all of you, because this session would not have been possible without you. So I place my thanks to and gratitude to all of you on record here. And again, thank you everyone for joining in with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anandal. Thank you, Anshuman, once more.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a delight.
Sure, sir. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ajit sir. You may end the meeting.
Yeah.
I can see my alumni also. Good. Thank you, everybody.